Okay, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you. I send you warm greetings from Sondo, South Korea, from the Green Climate Fund. Um, I would like to begin by way of introduction, giving a bit of the outline of this presentation in terms of the background of global climate finance architecture. I will also talk about the Green Climate Fund in terms of systems, processes, and investments. Then I will summarize and conclude with options for a number of questions that participants will be interested in. But let me take this opportunity to also thank the speakers that came before me for really setting an agenda that will enable me to advance my talk. I'll begin by looking at the global context. If we look at the impacts of climate variability and change on sustainable development, we can see that for the past 50 years, storms, floods, and tropical cyclones and droughts have caused significant impacts, impacting about 3.7 million in terms of the deaths and 7.6 billion in terms of the impact. And also the economics that deal with the losses are also quite significant on the average of $2.4 trillion annually, or 0.2% of global GDP. So this is very significant. And relatively, if you look at that of uh, least developed countries, Africa sits, least developed countries in particular, this is quite significant. But then also, if you reflect in terms of the commitment during the Paris Agreement, it's very clear that the level of ambition is very low. But the ambition is very clear, but if you look at what the countries have submitted and asked for, the quality of the information provided is low, and in most cases superficial and incomplete. So a better understanding of climate variability and change and its impact in terms of the long term will be very, very important. Also looking at the market assessment, we see lowest capacity in Africa, LDC and SITS. And this is very important for GCF, in particularly looking at the clients that we service. But also more importantly, we see that growth is driven by vibrant private sectors, energy, aviation, large-scale agriculture, infrastructure, resilience, and others. So more importantly, looking at this broadly, adaptation and mitigation are actually conjoined twins. They are Siamese twins. You cannot really separate them. They are really, really interrelated. And so if you look at, in terms of barriers, the lack of enabling environment for institutional effectiveness, limited government finances and budgets. That is where GCF and others come in. Lack of coverage, lack of infrastructure, uncoordinated interventions to support the effectiveness of existing projects, and the complexity that deals with addressing this, as well as the barriers due to markets that will enable the markets to be able to respond and support adaptation in particular. Adaptation, the way it's been marketed, doesn't seem to be like a good business, but the evidence on the ground shows otherwise. And so there's a growing demand for support in terms of adaptation. If you look at early warning, early action, very, very clear in terms of the submission to the Paris Agreement, particularly climate information and early warning, the broader resilient landscape adaptation have a very strong market potential that we need to help to unlock private sector investments and participation. It's also growing commitment in terms of the political process, the Africa Agenda 2063, you look at the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Global Framework for Climate Services, Sendai Framework, all allude to the fact that the commitment is growing, and also at the country, regional, and county levels, we have just heard how the commitment is growing. But then also creates opportunity to enhance coherence and complementarity of investment. So we have to look at the broader landscape and see how we can mobilize finance at scale to be able to address adaptation and resilience as a whole. And also leveraging private sector finance will be very, very critical in terms of blending also with public budgets and public-private partnerships will become very, very important. But let's look at the global architecture. If you look at the current thinking in terms of annual investment flows from developed to developing countries for 2014 to 2018, roughly, the private funds are about $62 billion in 2014. It went to 71 billion in 2017 and 79 billion in 2018. The public funds also from the average on 2013 to 2014 was 41 billion, and that for 2015 2016 was $56 billion. And so the annual global climate finance in terms of all countries, if you combine public and private sector between the period of 2017 to 2018 is about $579 billion. So the types of climate finance available mostly focuses on grants, concessional loans, guarantees, private equity, and other financing instruments and architectures. And so the diagram shows how the architecture is framed, looking at the contributors, that is mostly the developed countries, and the bilateral institutions, particularly looking at the COP process, the UNFCCC process, joint implementation and CDM, which more deals with private sector, and the other financing mechanism of the COP, where GCF is the lead in terms of volume and size and ambition. Adaptation Fund and GEF also constitute the three main institutions. And then we have others in terms of the non-UNFCCC financial mechanisms. And then we have the recipients that covers regional and national funds. But then I want to focus on the GCF. GCF was established in 2010 at COP16 by 194 countries. And then it had its first board meeting in 2012, and up to now we have about 173 projects approved, accounting for about 8.3 billion of GCF committed funds as of 2021. So GCF is an operating entity of the UNFCCC process that fosters paradigm shift to low emission and climate resilient development pathways in developing countries by providing the means of implementation in the form of finance to support climate action. And so as of now, the investment in terms of total project is 8.3 billion. And then for our readiness support facility, we have 296.4 million in 138 countries, and the projects 121 countries. But if you look at the regional distribution, you could see that Latin America, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia Pacific constitute the major regions that access our funds, with Asia Pacific having 72 projects, Africa 68 projects, and Latin America and the Caribbean 40 projects. But in terms of the total, if we combine GCF commitment with that of co-financing, then we have 30.2 billion and 1.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent abated, and benefiting about 498 million people globally. So the main engine when it comes to GCF is both the public and private sector, but I think private sector should be one of the main mechanisms through which we could mobilize finance at scale. So GCF pays particular attention to the role of private sector in addressing climate action. And within this, we have 5 areas of practice where we mobilize, we maximize mobilization and impact. So climate funds area where we mobilize equity investment for climate action through funds. And we also have financial institutions where we look at green lending and risk sharing through financial institutions. We have project finance, that looks at life cycle financing, and then climate markets that develop capital and carbon markets for impact. And then we also have climate technology and innovation where investment in transformative climate technologies are funded. But then if we look at the distribution of investment by sector, looking at public and private sector, for the public sector, for every GCF dollar invested, we are able to leverage about $2.3 from co-financing. So with our $5.6 billion, which we have invested in the public sector, we have about 13.1 billion as a co-financing. So we have a catalytic impact in terms of leveraging additional finance. And then if you look at the private sector, we have invested $2.8 billion and leverage $8.8 billion, which gives a co-financing ratio of about 1:3. But then looking at the composition of the portfolio in terms of thematic area, if we look at the investment that has gone into adaptation and mitigation, we have 48% that has gone into adaptation and 52% that has gone into mitigation. But our main mandate from the convention is to have a 50-50 balance between mitigation and adaptation. We also have, in terms of the public and private sector, we have 67% investment going into the public sector and the private sector 33%. And then we look at the instruments that I alluded to earlier in the presentation. And so the grant component covers the biggest part with 44% in terms of grant investment. And the loan 43%, we have equity 6%. And also have resource-based payments, which is 7%, and guarantees and others, roughly around 1%. So GCF has a flexible financing instruments that it deploys, very, very flexible in terms of how it deploys its investment as against mitigation, adaptation, public-private sector, and the financial instruments. So what do we look for in a project? How can we fund projects? I mean, looking at the ideas that Professor Omar and others have highlighted, how do we support you to develop projects so that we can fund them? As a climate fund, we first look at additionality of GCF funding. So why should GCF invest in a project? And so we look at the fact that the project needs to crowd in additional finance on top of what GCF will invest. But more importantly, we are a climate fund. So the climate rationale is paramount. The climate impact of investment is key, and the scientific evidence in terms of the climate science basis needs to be established. It also has to be country-driven because the countries are those that have the mandate. The countries need to provide us with no objection to enable us to fund the project. So it has to be aligned with the country NDCs and also the country development, sustainable development agenda. We also look at 6 investment criteria. That's the impact potential. That is to say, for every dollar of investment, how much impact do we make in terms of the number of people that benefit from this? We also look at paradigm shift potential, which deals with the innovativeness of the interventions. We also look at sustainable development potential that shows the economic, social, and environmental co-benefits of those investments. And then we look at the needs of the recipient, country ownership, and then the efficiency and effectiveness of the project as a whole. So these are the criteria upon which we do our investment. But then we focus on 8 result areas for mitigation, for adaptation. A project can have a combination of any of these 8 areas, which is energy, transport, building cities, industries, and ecosystems adaptation, and then livelihoods of people and communities, health, food, and water security, forests and land use, as well as infrastructure as the main components for adaptation. We also look at some compliance and policy issues in terms of assessing the fiduciary standards, the risks management, environmental and social safeguards, as well as the legal standards. And also we look at the completeness of the documentation that is submitted to us. So what are the processes? How long does the project go through a cycle? First, it begins with a country program where GCF provides support for establishing systems and processes within the country. And so like in the case of, let's say, Kenya, we have a focal point, that's National Designated Authority, that will provide financial and technical support to articulate the country's priorities for climate action. And then based on that, the project is originated, the proposal generation stage starts, where the National Designated Authority, together with an accredited entity, we'll start a discussion. The ideas and concepts are put together, the form of a concept note. We will then review it. It goes through to the funding proposal development stage and the submission, which we will review. It goes through what we call due diligence. And then once we approve it, it has to go also to an independent technical advisory panel that will cross-check our assessment. And when the two agree, then it goes to the board for approval. And when it's approved, then we need to put in place the legal arrangement that will enable its implementation. So the project approval process requires a country-driven approach. The countries and the communities are in the driver's seat. They drive the process. They are the ones that determine what project should be funded by us. And so we work with quite a range of accredited entities, including the NEMA from Kenya. We also have the Kenyan Development Bank. We have in Ethiopia also the Ministry of Finance, and quite a number of other accredited entities, about 100 of them, that will work through, and they will be able to submit projects to us for funding. And so let me come back to look at one of the core areas of ICPAC, which is more to do with climate information and early warning system. Today, GCF investment in this area exceeds $1.8 billion. With co-financing, we are talking about $2.2 billion. And then in terms of distribution across regions and country groupings, we have the Asia Pacific having 44% of the investment, Africa 34%, Latin America and the Caribbean 20%, East Europe 2%. And when it comes to the accredited entities that I spoke about, 94% of these investments actually is accessed by international accredited entities. And the direct access centers like KDB, NEMA, and the rest constitute only 6% of the climate information early warning systems portfolio. But what is more important is the fact that 21% of the project focus on modernization of hydromet services, production of climate services, and elements that deals with climate services. But then 79% is on sector application, which is very clear that the countries are more interested in how we can apply climate information and early warning system to development. So climate services has no value until it has been applied or used. So this is very, very clear from our portfolio that we need to transition from just the production of climate information into application where we can drive uptake and investment in climate information and early warning systems. So what will we look for in terms of a transformational project? We look for transformational planning and programming as core to a project design and implementation. So climate science should inform strategic plans, country programming. Implementation should aim at coherence and complementarity to reduce waste and improve efficiency and effectiveness. We also will look at catalyzing climate innovation as a paradigm shifting factor in terms of use of innovations, global framework for climate services, J-bond, impact-based forecast, forecast-based financing, and then more importantly, IT technology in terms of big data, cloud computing, IoT, and the rest also being very important to underpin the design of projects and create strategic partnership, quality management, and then improve policy. But also mobilizing investment at scale is very important. So we also will look at innovative financing options enabled by blended finance. Key partnership to leverage and scale up investment is also very key. And then importantly, expansion and replication of knowledge. And I think I want to stress on the presentation of Professor Omar in terms of indigenous knowledge. Climate adaptation is local. It has to be indigenous. It has to come from the people and has to be co-designed by the people. So knowledge is very, very critical. So we will look at knowledge brokering on climate investment, looking at the indigenous science and technology through institutional collaboration, monitoring, evaluation, and learning to ensure that we can really measure the impact of the projects. And so in a way, the GCF plays as a facilitating role which will enable the synergetic action between government and private sector to take place. So we look for opportunity to engage. We will be very keen to see projects coming from the region. At the moment, I'm supporting NEMA with the program on the Athi River in Kenya. I'm also looking forward to other projects from the region, and hopefully we should be able to design projects to address the very present and unique challenges that was highlighted during the earlier presentations. Thanks.